Welcome to Israel Explained, where we help you understand Israel, Israel's neighbors, and provide you with context to understand the Middle East. My name's Avery Chenault, and I'm joined by Passages resident scholar Josiah McGee. On Hamas's October 7th attack of Israel, Hamas broadcasted their atrocities to the world using social media. The backlash to Hamas broadcasting their atrocities on social media was intense, but it was extremely short-lived. Since that day, Hamas has continued to use social media and other media forms as a way to spread propaganda and manipulate public opinion of their terror organization. So today, we're unpacking a little bit about how terrorists use propaganda to influence public opinion. So Josiah, today, can we just start off by talking a little bit about, do terrorists actually care about their public image? You know, we see specifically in the case of Hamas, we saw on October 7th just such horrific atrocities. But if they would go to such a level of such evil, do they actually care what other people around the world are thinking about the things they're doing?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, the videos that were broadcast on October 7th would naturally lead to that question. Mm-hmm. Do they realize the type of impact that those videos have on the broader world, and why are they sharing videos like that, or so publicly sharing the details of what they were doing on October 7th? But I think it is important to note that, yes, terror organizations do actually care about their image, and they're actually very thoughtful about that. During the course of my studies at the University of London, one thing that stood out to me pretty significantly was that groups that study terrorism or people that study terrorism tend to fall into one of two camps. Unfortunately, there's a bit of this weird dichotomy that exists. Either they think that terrorists are just a bunch of psychotic weirdos who can't be understood, that there's no rhyme or reason to what they do, or they're so fascinated by terrorists that they begin to sympathize with them almost in some respect, or even attribute some sort of noble intent to the terrorist or the terror organization. You see this when people start to use terms like resistance instead of terrorism to describe the type of activities that someone like Hamas does or engages in. And the reality is that terrorists, I think, are not stupid or noble. But unfortunately, we tend to stereotype them as one or the other and not really think about them as an intelligent political operation. But that's what they are. It is, of course, inherently evil terrorism, but there is also something in a twisted form or fashion inherently rational about it as well. There's a rational calculus, and they are a political operation. So a successful terror organization has to be very politically intelligent, has to be very concerned with its image and its public relations, the way that it describes itself and is understood by the rest of the world. Terrorism, as we've defined in other videos that you can find in this Israel Explained series, is unjust violence, especially and usually against civilians, but for a political purpose. It's not something that's done simply because someone is mentally ill or insane. It's for an explicit political purpose. They want something out of the violence that they're engaging in. If terrorism does not convince anyone of a specific political message, it's a failure. It's useless. It's not met any of its aims or goals. And image and public relations, as a result, they are one of terror organizations' most powerful weapons in the fight that they're trying to engage in. So projecting the right image is important, and it's how they're going to convince other people of their message. It's how they convince other people to join them, that the cause is worthy enough that they should actually have other people joining them or supporting them. It's how they convince other people to be on their side, politically speaking, or in the public arena. It's how they convince other people to give in to their demands, even. There's something inherently rational about the way that they use violence as a tool of negotiation as well. And again, that doesn't make it right. It is evil, but it is a very politically intelligent way that they go about what they're doing. And that's why propaganda is so important. When these terror organizations are broadcasting messages or information, especially if it is of a biased or misleading nature, or if they're controlling it in the way that they usually do, they're using it in an effort to publicize a particular political point, a particular political cause, and they're going to use that information to their own ends, which means that they're not always going to tell the truth. They're going to find a way to craft the information or control the information getting out in such a way that it makes them either look good or it shares a particular message that they want getting out.
Yeah. I think a lot of times whenever we're thinking about terrorism, kind of like you said, a lot of people just think that it's just all like crazy, chaotic violence. And yes, it is, but it's very carefully thought out in many ways. And I think we've really seen that a lot recently with particularly in regards to social media and the way that a lot of different terrorist groups have used social media to advance their cause or spread their message or manipulate public opinion or whatever it is. And there's been so many examples since the war with Israel and Hamas has started of just especially Gen Z, the way that they've interacted with this war on social media has just been, there's nothing like it. You know, it's really historical. And I think it's crazy to think about 20 years ago, really there was like 1,000 for us living in the United States, like there was 1,000-mile difference between us and a terrorist, like, 8,000, 10,000 miles away. But now there's the connection is through an app, and they know that, and they're continuing to use those kind of things to their advantage. Sure. And something I wanted to mention, a few months ago, I think it was in November 2023 when this was a thing that was happening, there was this social media trend amongst Gen Z. It was primarily on TikTok, but basically some young Gen Zers found out about this letter that Osama bin Laden essentially wrote to America as like a threat of like, here's everything that you guys have done, and here's how I'm going to respond. Like, you guys are unrighteous, evil people, all of these different things. And it's not like a secret letter. Like, it's available. Like, it's something that people can read. It's not like these people had discovered a secret or anything. But there is a small section of this letter. I wanted to read a quote to just kind of help us understand the situation. And it says, "Palestine shall not be seen captive, for we will try to break its shackles. The United States shall pay for its arrogance with the blood of Christians and their funds." And so many Gen Zers found this one small sentence from the whole letter and saw Osama bin Laden's support of Palestine and were immediately on his side.
Right.
And we're like, oh, this is like the hidden secret we didn't know. Like, he's in support of Palestine, so therefore we think that he was not as bad of a person as America painted him to be, or different things like that. And it was a lot of really uneducated things that were being spread on social media. And eventually, people at TikTok found out about it, got taken down, all of that kind of stuff. But I think that's just one small example of how Gen Z is interacting with different kind of terrorist propaganda, particularly on social media, and how important it is to be aware of that and to understand the actual context behind it. Because I think just this one small quote I read, how out of context it was taken and how much it spread so quickly on social media, just really shows you social media can be a very powerful tool for good, but also it can be used for a lot of damage and danger, as we've seen recently.
Oh, it's the great multiplier of misinformation.
Exactly.
It's very dangerous.
Exactly.
Yes,
and I thought that
it's a great story.
This letter to America trend was just such an example of like multiplying misinformation. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about how terrorists use propaganda to benefit them locally. So up to now, we've talked a lot about how they use it to influence the international audience and different things like that. But how do they use propaganda, social media, different things like that to help them recruit locally?
Yeah, so locally, terrorists are going to use propaganda for a few purposes. And we'll get into how in just a moment, because it's more than just social media, but a bit about maybe why first. So they'll use it in a local context in order to shore up local support, because terrorists, of course, are going to be concerned about global attitudes towards their cause. But also, you don't have a cause if you don't have any local support for what you're trying to do. So you kind of have to start there. And they're going to use propaganda even there to try to accomplish their purposes. Typically, what you have to do in a local context is start by convincing the people in your community that whatever side you're painting for yourself, the other side is evil, and the terrorists are the good guys. So it's basically flipping upside down what is good and what is evil in that context. Common themes that are going to help accomplish that are going to be things like denying historical claims by the other side, promoting conspiracy theories about them, fabricating false testimony. And really the point is to get to a point where you've painted the other side not just as evil, but someone who is dangerous and actively threatening your side. And then what they do is they use that misinformation propaganda to promote the narrative that terrorism isn't really terrorism. It's defense.
Yeah.
It's resistance. It's protection of someone who's under threat, of someone who is evil. And so again, it's really telling the great lie that the good guys are the bad guys and the bad guys are the good guys. And using that to sort of change the way that the people, even in your own community, think about the role that you play. When it comes to how they do this, I think there's a couple of things that they're going to be very interested in doing. So again, social media is one example, but more than just that, controlling formal education. It goes to not just informal communication channels, but even formal communication channels of official messages, trying to control things like textbooks. So we saw some examples of this when we had the conversation about UNRWA. If viewers want, they can watch that video, learn more about how Hamas took advantage of the fact that there were textbooks that were really teaching insightful messages about the Jews and about Israel. You also, on social media, do have informal examples as well, examples of cherry picking evidence of Israel's wrongdoing, hiding evidence of Hamas's crimes, putting on these staged productions of Israeli crimes. There's some really fascinating videos that have come out where you have one character, for example, or I should say one person who's reported to have been performing really in several videos of purported crimes committed by Israel. And it's all these videos, it's the same person. It's kind of insane.
Yeah, it's crazy
how this is supposed to work, but people buy it, that Israel has actually done all these things that he accuses them of doing. So there's really a lot of very dangerous work being done on social media as well.
Absolutely.
There's, of course, other news outlets as well. So it now seems very clear that Al Jazeera, for example, among other outlets, works very closely with Hamas to tell their version of events in Gaza.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is that on October 7th itself, yes, Hamas live streamed or broadcast all of these videos of what was happening on October 7th. But very quickly after, Hamas tried to spin the narrative and basically change the story and say, what happened on October 7th wasn't really an attack on Israeli civilians. It was an attack on Israeli soldiers.
Yes.
Or things like that.
Yes.
And organizations like Al Jazeera, these news outlets in the Middle East, very quickly sort of helped them to spin the story and change the story in a matter of weeks to where they were telling the story more like that than what actually happened on October 7th. And it included both October 7th and the war that followed even. So there's a documentary about the war in Gaza that was meant to sort of valorize Hamas, to make them seem like they were the great protectors of the Palestinians and the Gazan people, and trying to, again, assign these noble characteristics to leaders of Hamas, including people like Sinwar, the man who was responsible for October 7th. And it's just amazing what you can accomplish when you control formal education like textbooks, or when you influence it, at the very least, if not directly control, when you are able to control what happens on social media, when you're able to control news outlets. It's amazing what happens. There were polls done a few months after October 7th in which many Palestinians reported that they did not believe Hamas had committed atrocities against civilians, for example. But when you dig into those polls further and ask, okay, is there anything there that maybe suggests why? You find things like many of the same respondents would argue that if Hamas had committed atrocities against civilians, like sexual assault, for example, just pick one, then they would condemn those atrocities. But the problem is they denied having seen any evidence of these atrocities, evidence which was available to the rest of the world, but was not available to the everyday Palestinian in some cases, of exactly what had actually happened on October 7th. And this just demonstrates both the extent to which Hamas was able to control the information about October 7th and the effect that it had on the Palestinians and how they viewed the situation.
Yeah, it really is interesting to kind of unpack the way that Hamas helped control this narrative after October 7th. And something I just always think is so interesting to study and understand is just the way that social media plays a huge role in it. And I think maybe it's because I am a part of Gen Z, or just that's something I'm interested in. But really, you have seen so many things of Hamas, like you mentioned, having like an actor in some sort of way. Like I know what you're talking, like it's the same actor that's died like multiple times and
Right.
died multiple times in different videos and things like that, but it comes across people's feed and they're being influenced by this. And of course they would, because it does look quite horrific. And there are people that have had very horrific things happen to them. But when we're spinning the narrative like this, it's putting the wrong emphasis on things that aren't true, and the wrong victims that were not actually victims, and things like that.
Right.
And there's also several polls that have been done regarding people's social media consumption regarding the Middle East. And there's so many people, particularly in Gen Z, that get all their information, or most of their information, about what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in the Middle East, from social media.
Yeah.
And it's really scary to think about how much of the content around the Middle East is being manufactured by Hamas propaganda or different members of Hamas. So it really is something that's quite crazy to think about in regards to everything that's been happening. So I want to talk a little bit now about how terrorists use propaganda to recruit not just locally, but internationally. So how are terrorists able to take someone that lives in maybe Europe or the United States or some other part of the world where these terrorist organizations are not located, and convince them to join their cause?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a little bit challenging to answer that question in the context of Hamas, because a couple of things. One, it's not very easy to just walk into Gaza right now and join Hamas.
Yeah.
Two, Hamas is, unlike some other terror organizations, a little bit more particular in terms of its political focus, which is on the Palestinian issue, and less on the idea of creating this global Islamic state, for example. So you really would have to look at more something like an example like ISIS.
Yeah.
In the 2010s, especially, their goal was to create a global Islamic state, and it was much easier for them to recruit people internationally who had maybe less connection to a specific political cause, but were more interested in sort of this global mission that ISIS was trying to promote. So in that case, what ISIS did was a few things. And they managed to, in the process, recruit tens of thousands of fighters from around the world, from over 100 countries, in order to join them in the fight that was going on in the Middle East. And at the time, it was primarily in Iraq, and Syria, and places like that. But they managed to recruit them through a few different tools, some of that being ideological content, some of it being proof of atrocities. Weirdly enough, it actually helped them to recruit people when they, again, like Hamas, they publish proof of their atrocities. And some people, it turns them off. Some people, it excites them.
Yeah.
And it recruits the kind of people that they need in order to commit more atrocities when they are able to put a little bit of that evidence out there. And unfortunately, again, in a very sick, twisted way, excite a certain kind of person to join them. And they were very careful to not just put stuff out there, like their ideas or evidence of what they were doing, but also specific calls to action. So using simple tools like social media, they were able to communicate some really important messages and a clear call to action for especially young people to come join them. Some examples of the kinds of things that they tried to communicate would be, if you feel alone, you're not.
Yeah.
ISIS, unfortunately, targeted vulnerable populations. If you look at the profile of someone who would join an international terror organization as a foreign terrorist, foreign terror fighter or something like that, they're not necessarily uneducated. They're not necessarily impoverished. A lot of people would assume that, the stereotypical terrorist is someone who's doing it for the money or something like that. And that's not necessarily true. It's one of the challenges with combating recruitment for terrorism is that you can't just leverage someone with money and convince them not to become a terrorist necessarily. That's not necessarily the reason why they become a terrorist in the first place. A lot of them, one common profile for some of these young people included some degree of loneliness, isolation, or disenfranchisement. So some of them were immigrants to Europe, for example. They were relatively well educated. They had probably better job opportunities and economic prospects in Europe than they did in the Middle East. But at the same time, they were in a place that wasn't home. They were in a place that didn't feel like home. They didn't have a strong sense of community, and that sense of loneliness or detachment from community, maybe feeling a little bit disenfranchised in their new host country because of that lack of community, created something that ISIS was able to exploit, take advantage of. They also were able to capitalize on the fact that some people felt powerless. To most, the images, again, of ISIS atrocities are horrifying. To other people, however, they represent the opportunity to exact some kind of revenge and to finally be in power over the people that you resent. So, again, it's horrifying. But put in front of the right person, it can also excite them to do more of the same. And that's something that ISIS exploited and took advantage of. And the last thing that ISIS really tried to communicate to these young people is that they can be a part of something bigger than themselves. And we know this about Gen Z. It's very stereotypically true of Gen Z that young people want to be part of something important. They want to make a difference. They want to make the world a better place. They want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And again, that's not a bad thing. But an organization like ISIS or a terror organization can exploit that and manipulate that in some really cruel ways. And it's a very powerful tool that is available to them, that they can use that ability to be a part of something meaningful to motivate young people to do some really horrifying things or to support some really horrifying causes. And unfortunately, ISIS was probably one of the most successful examples of not just convincing people to be on their side, but again, convincing tens of thousands of people from around the world to physically uproot themselves, move to the Middle East and fight for them.
Which is, it's just crazy to think about how much effort and manipulation goes into making something like that successful. And I think particularly in the case of ISIS, when we think about all of the crimes they've committed and all of the atrocities that they've done, we think about the people living in the Middle East or victims of other terror attacks around the world that were a part of ISIS. We think of like those people as being victims of ISIS, which they 100% have experienced the worst of this kind of terrorism. But you were talking about the people that ISIS targets to join their group are also very vulnerable in their own way, you know, and so they are being targeted just as much and in a very different way, but being like exploited and targeted to join this cause that they think is great, but obviously is perpetuating a lot of evil.
One thing that I think is to comment on that, because you made a really good point just now, that the people who are being targeted for recruitment are also vulnerable in a certain respect. And this is not to excuse any of the acts of violence that they engage in. But one analogy that is really important to think about in terms of how do you understand a terror organization, it's a lot like a cult. Unfortunately, in this case, it is a death cult. It's a very ugly kind of cult in the sense that they're not just creating a very powerful sense of loyalty. They are also using that as a means to convince people, in many cases, to carry out acts of violence and even die for the cause, which is just horrible. It's horrible because of the lives that are lost for the cause. It's horrible because of the lives that are lost as a result of the violence. And it's a pure form of evil. But it is important to understand ISIS as an organization and the way that they manipulate people through the use of information to do things on their behalf. It's like a death cult, essentially.
It's like just that act alone is perpetuating the terrorism in itself, which is just really really horrific to think about, but also it's important for us to know when considering these things. So I want to talk a little bit now about how terrorists are able to use propaganda to convince people to be on their side. So I think we've seen this a lot, particularly regarding the Israel-Hamas war, especially on campus where things are just so heated right now and different situations like that. People are like, what side are you on? Are you on Israel's side or Hamas's side? And I think for some people it would make sense. Well, like, why would I be on the side of a terrorist group? But we've seen a lot recently, there's rising support for Hamas especially amongst a younger population and different things like that. So can you just share a little bit about how these organizations are able to convince people to be on their side?
Well, they can certainly use propaganda and misinformation very, very powerfully, as you've just pointed out. I think we've already talked a little bit about this, but I'll just make a couple of observations about some of what Hamas did after October 7 to use these information tools to their own benefit. So certainly with tremendous effectiveness, immediately after October 7, as we've already mentioned, they were sort of changing the story, even in the first couple of weeks after October 7, from we did these things to Israel to, we really only attacked the IDF. We didn't actually attack all the Israeli civilians, and in changing the narrative very quickly, spinning it so that the facts were distorted very quickly. And also the morality of what they did was distorted very, very quickly. And it really didn't take very long. A day or two after October 7, there were already protests against Israel, who hadn't even invaded Gaza yet. It had just been the victim of this horrific attack on October 7, hadn't launched a counter invasion yet, was still trying to remove Hamas terrorists from southern Israel. And people were already protesting against Israel at that point. I mean, that is really remarkable. You want to talk about someone who has just incredible public relations at their disposal. I mean, Hamas, unfortunately, it seems to have had some amazing public relations at their disposal to accomplish something like that. And how do they do that? I think there's a couple of things. One, again, immediately denying the atrocities or the accusations of atrocities, immediately accusing Israel of atrocities, or trying to convince people that Israel had it coming, that it was an act of self-defense, not an act of terrorism, which, again, it was not. And if our viewers would like to know more about why, again, we have this video on what is terrorism that can explain that. It was absolutely not an act of self-defense, but an act of terrorism. But they were already, in the days after October 7, challenging those facts and challenging those narratives and working to create a cloud of misinformation. That cloud of misinformation was then used throughout the war to really make even worse the fog of war. War in and of itself is very confusing. It's chaotic. There's a lot of things happening, typically very quickly. It's very destructive. It can be hard to put the pieces together of what exactly happened during war. But when you have someone who's intentionally adding confusion to that equation, it just makes it exponentially worse. And Hamas was obviously trying to do that. Now, that's what they were doing in order to sort of confuse people. But beyond that, it appears that Hamas was also trying to instigate. There's some evidence that either Hamas, maybe not Hamas, but certainly some allies openly stated that they were funding misinformation campaigns and even protests in the United States that were designed to make a splash, turn public opinion by creating some headlines, that sort of thing. So just think about that. Hamas isn't just putting bad information out there or mistruths, distorting the facts, or spinning the facts to their own benefit. They're also, their allies are putting money into the system, the public media system, or whatever it may be, to convince people to go rally and protest and generate even more headlines in the States in support of Hamas. And what ends up happening is that Hamas capitalizes on that. They capitalize on the fact that we as a society have been conditioned by smartphones and emerging technology and social media to have incredibly short attention spans. We don't think as critically as we used to. We don't think as deeply as we used to. We don't have the memory that we used to. We pay attention to what is immediately in front of us. And we easily forget about something that we just heard or saw. And we don't have the ability to think contextually. We can read a headline saying, Israel just did something horrible, and forget all about what happened on October 7 because we have such short attention spans. And Hamas knows this. And they can take advantage of this by using all the technology that is at their disposal.
Exactly. I think it's just really crazy to think about how much information is available to us now. And this is a whole nother topic in itself, but just the idea that we can be here in the United States living our lives, doing whatever, and just open our phone for 5 minutes, just scroll at a few things, and you're seeing footage that is made possibly by Hamas in Gaza. And then you scroll to the next thing, and maybe it's a video of someone cooking or like a normal thing. And then you scroll to the next video and it's something else about a war in the Middle East. Like, that is just insane that we have that much content at our disposal and how it's being manipulated in a way. So I want to talk now about psychological warfare. So particularly in the Middle East, and unfortunately, psychological warfare is a tool in war that impacts a lot of civilians as well and can be quite horrific. Right. So I want to talk about how terrorists are able to use propaganda as a tool to further psychological warfare.
So this is something that I think came up especially during the course of the second string of hostage releases, yes, which took place, in the spring of 2025, or early winter / spring of 2025. And in those cases, what you saw was not just the release of a hostage, but also these grandiose ceremonies. Mm-hmm. Okay. Those ceremonies, I think, are one of the best examples of how a terror organization can use psychological warfare for their purposes.
Absolutely.
You did see previously some examples like proof of life videos that were staged, yes, and somewhat produced, but the production quality wasn't quite as high. Mm-hmm. And the purpose was obviously to put pressure on the Israeli government to stop fighting against Hamas and make a deal for the hostages, that kind of thing. The hostage ceremonies were next level in terms of the production value of the propaganda and the psychological warfare that they were engaging in for a couple of reasons. One, they include a much higher production quality and more intentional planning. So, for example, they have often gathered a crowd. It's meant to look like it's a lot of people. In reality, most of these ceremonies weren't actually that many people.
Yeah.
A few hundred, maybe 1,000 people, but it wasn't actually a massive crowd of people. But they made it look like it was by gathering enough people to make it look like a crowd, and then putting their cameras in the right place to make it look like there's a lot of people here. They also used a lot of fancy backdrops, graphics, and stages and different things to make it look like they had put a lot of time and effort and planning into these ceremonies. They used these backdrops typically to put some sort of message up that was demonizing or threatening Israel or the hostages or something like that. These ceremonies included some sort of show of force and organization by Hamas. So in order to release the hostage, they were going to parade Hamas members first with their weapons and their trucks, many of which we saw on October 7. Not every ceremony included this, but especially the later ones did include this display of, we are an armed organization that has a lot of power at our disposal. And they also forced even the Red Cross to go through these performative aspects of the ceremony, like sitting down with a member of Hamas and signing paperwork together to release the hostage, which is just a way of showing that Hamas is in charge, and we're exerting power even over the Red Cross, forcing them to go through this weird process of releasing a hostage. And it also included some displays of affection between hostages and Hamas members. Coerced, of course. It's not like the hostages actually had affection for their captors. But they reported after being released that they were told, if you want to be released, you have to do these things during the ceremony. You have to wave, you have to smile, you have to, kiss this Hamas person on the cheek or whatever. And it's all just really crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And this isn't even getting to the fact that they were also given these sort of trophies in some cases.
Yeah.
They were given these souvenirs, they were given these diplomas of captivity. Congratulations, you survived captivity in Hamas. This is your signed diploma with your release date or whatever. I mean, who does that? Just crazy stuff. But all of these things had a purpose. So it was obviously, like I said, a much higher production level that they were trying to engage in. But it was also a much higher level of psychological warfare.
Yeah.
Because they were significantly more effective in communicating certain messages that a simple video of a hostage in a tunnel isn't going to communicate.
Yeah.
Some things that this was able to communicate was that really both to Israel and to Gazans that Hamas is in control. Yeah, we're not going anywhere, or we're not willing to go anywhere, I should say. And we're not willing to be forced out or go into exile. We intend to stay. Yeah. And we have the guns and the members, the fighters to make it happen. And we have the resources to put on these elaborate ceremonies.
Yeah.
How they have the ability to cobble together the resources for these elaborate ceremonies, I don't know, given the level of destruction that the war has caused in Gaza. But they're making a statement that we're here and we still have a lot of resources at our disposal and we're still in control. And it's a distortion of the reality that really Hamas is in fact cruel and is not actually as popular among Palestinians as they would like you to believe. You know, there are reported cases around these ceremonies as well when the ceasefire started that Hamas wasn't just preparing for these ceremonies, they were also going out and breaking bones of or even executing individuals who are accused of being traitors or protesting against Hamas or things like that. So they were it was not just a way of releasing the hostages. It was also a way of sending a message to Israel and to Palestinians that don't test us. We still think we're in control. We're the ones actually in power in Gaza, and we want it to stay that way. There was also a lot of effort, obviously, in the backdrops and the graphics and sort of the messaging surrounding these ceremonies. It was meant to deflect responsibility onto Israel and convince others that Hamas is engaged in a noble fight. And they did their best to convince the world that Israel is the reason why the hostages are in this position to begin with. In the case of the release of the bodies, the first release of bodies, Mr. Lifshitz, also the Bibas family, Shiri and her two sons, the backdrop was very clearly meant, and the messaging surrounding the release of those coffins was meant to convey that Hamas wanted to blame Israel for the deaths of these hostages and was not willing to accept any responsibility themselves for the deaths of these hostages. So they're really doing their best to, again, challenge the way people think about even the hostage crisis itself, let alone everything else that happened on October 7 and during the war since. The acts of affection that are coerced, it's a lie that has a purpose. You know, you're not just twisting the knife before you release someone. You're also trying to distract the world from how horribly the hostages were treated during their captivity. After the hostages get out, you start to see these interviews. You know, there's one interview, Mr. Sharabi, I think, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but he gave an interview that was horrifying after his release. Just absolutely terrible about the conditions he was kept in, the starvation that he experienced, the torture that he endured. I mean, just horrible, horrible things. But Hamas is going to do their best to distract the world from those reports by forcing these hostages before they're released to show some affection to their captors and convince the world that, well, okay, if it was really that bad in Gaza, then they wouldn't be, you know, smiling or waving or hugging their captors before they leave and that kind of thing. All the details matter. I'm just going down the list. The fact that a Red Cross member is forced to sit there at a table and sign papers, it's meant to send a specific message that Hamas is trustworthy, that it should be treated as an equal member of the international community, not as an evil organization that has done horrible things. So it's all very well thought out. I think it's easy when you just watch the video to say, what are they doing? Why are they doing this? But if you think about each of the details, every detail matters. Every detail was meant to send a specific message and really to accomplish, I would say, two things. One, you know, pressure Israel to allow Hamas to stay in power in exchange for the hostages. And the second thing is really to convince Palestinians that Hamas is winning and that they should stay in power. And it's dangerous even for Palestinians to challenge Hamas at this point.
The psychological warfare that we've seen coming out of these hostage ceremonies has just been next level, and just so horrific. And
I agree.
It's just awful to see that the hostages, the living hostages, were subject to this psychological warfare up to the very last second of their captivity in Gaza.
Can you imagine 500 days of that?
I know, just so horrific. And then thinking about the hostages that were murdered in captivity, even after their death, their coffins are being used as a puppet of this warfare,
Right.
Just how horrific that is it's really important to understand just how horrific it is, so that we can have a better understanding of how to advocate for these hostages. That at the time we're recording this, there are still hostages in Gaza.
Yeah.
So I want to conclude our conversation today with a few action points. So we've discussed a lot about propaganda, psychological warfare. So what should our viewers do if they come across this propaganda, and how are we supposed to respond to such serious things as these? Is there anything we can do? And if so, what?
Yeah, I would say it's easy to sort of just throw up your hands and say, well, this is just a horrible situation that we find ourselves in, that all of this propaganda exists. But I don't want people to feel like you don't have any agency.
Yeah.
Because you do. In many ways, the reason why propaganda is so effective is because we let it be that effective, that we allow ourselves to be conditioned in such a way that it is as effective as it is. And so there's some ways that you can push back on that, pushing back on the effects of social media and technology and the way that it's taught us how to think, and pushing back against the misinformation itself.
Yeah.
So I would say a couple things. One, if you have the knowledge to refute something, say something.
Yeah.
Don't let misinformation go unaddressed and be afraid to say something if you know that it is a lie. The second thing, though, and I'm speaking to, I think, probably a lot of people who are going to feel this way, if you're not confident that you actually have the knowledge or that you know something to be true or a lie, then try to find out.
Yeah.
I think just allowing something that is confusing to go by without trying to discern what is real and what is true and what is not is not responsible either. I think we do need to be discerning and try to understand what's true and what is not. So I would say, if you need some tips on how to do that, don't believe everything you hear, first and foremost.
Yeah.
Question things, ask questions, be a little bit skeptical. That's okay. Try to understand what is true and what is not by first asking questions and thinking critically, and don't assume that everything that you hear is true. Challenge some of those assumptions instead. Try to read multiple reliable sources to find the truth. What I like to tell people is, you're much better off, first and foremost, reading local sources, because they're going to have better information, better, more up-to-date, more contextualized information, generally speaking, than just reading some random news source in the US, or certainly better than just reading one person's Twitter account or TikTok account or whatever. So try to read as many sources as you can. Try to read as many reliable and ideally more local sources as you can, and then put the pieces together, because with that context, you'll be able to get a much better picture of what's true and what's not. And if you have the ability, try to see it for yourself and bypass a lot of the filters that are online. So don't just engage these ideas on social media. If you have the ability to go, let's say, on a trip to Israel, for example, with passages, shameless plug, do it. You're going to learn so much more by meeting people face to face and engaging them directly without all of those filters that filter the way that we process information online. And you'll be able to ask those hard questions and discern much better, I think, what is actually true and what's not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is great advice. And I think when we're thinking about propaganda and social media, it takes a lot of people to contribute to what our social media is today. A lot of people to contribute to the spreading of psychological warfare and propaganda. But just as much as people are contributing, you can also refute the things that are being put out there that are not true, and educate yourself, educate the people around you, and don't be afraid to ask questions and do the research. So I think that's all really wonderful advice. Thank you so much for this conversation and for sharing this with us. And to our viewers, thank you so much for taking time out of your day today to listen to this. We hope it was helpful in answering some of your questions about Israel and providing you with more context. If you have any questions about what was discussed today, feel free to leave a comment below and we would be happy to answer. If you're looking for more resources or more content related to the Middle East, be sure to check us out on social media. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.